Denis Mahon charitable trust now for 5 years, and we've worked together on a number of collaborations and loans. And the Denis Mahon Charitable Trust has a real interest in supporting smaller institutions through very focused exhibitions. And with this exhibition, Techno, Medioevo, that is taking place at the moment, and the study day, this is a huge opportunity for the museum to be able to do something with modern and contemporary art. We have a very historic collection and historic buildings, and this very broad narrative, but to bring in an interesting juxtaposition with works such as these and with the Contemporary Art Collective is an incredibly positive thing for us, and brings in a new audience. Maybe many of you have already visited many times, but I would not be shocked if that was not the case. So it opens us up to a new audience, which is great for us. So I hope you enjoy it today and find it fascinating and insightful, and that it will open up new and interesting avenues for you all. I thank you very much, and now I will hand over to Orienta and read this microphone.
Yeah, okay, thank you, Tom. And thanks to all of you for being here with us today. On behalf of the Denis Mahon Charitable Trust, I would like to thank our distinguished speakers, especially Dr. John Spike, Director of the Moscarel Museum of Art, Gary Bell-Jones, Director of Flattime House, and Professor Marcello Pecchioli, Curator, Global Strategist, and Leader of the Bologna-based association Age of Future, a brotherhood of artists that he formed in the mid-1990s, and whose work feature in the exhibition currently on display at Museum of the Order of St. John. The aim of Age of Future is to propose a new medieval imagination through alternative history and pseudo-real worlds, new iconography, and historical reenactments. The exhibition is supported by the Denis Mahon Charitable Trust, which seeks to promote intellectual curiosity, academic debate, and ongoing art historical research. In the spirit of Age of Future Reloaded, Sir Denis's legacy lives on. His charitable trust continues his work and supports his interests. We would like to thank the scientific community of young academics from Imperial College, from University of Cambridge, UCL, and the Courtauld Institute of Art for their support. And now please welcome my co-trustee, Suzanne Marriott, of the Denis Mahon Charitable Trust. Suzanne.
Sir Denis Mahon was one of the most distinguished art historians and collectors of the 20th century, and a very determined campaigner, which is why we have free museum entry in this country. His legacy to us all is maintained through his charitable foundation, the Sir Denis Mahon Charitable Trust, which continues Sir Denis's philanthropic work, his support to museums and galleries, his art historical research, the promotion of his collection to the general public, and the support of the young and up-and-coming artists, students and scholars. He endowed a prize at the Royal Drawing School, which is awarded to a graduate who has excelled in their drawing studies, a skill which the Prince of Wales has sought to re-establish through his own charity of the Drawing School. The Sir Denis Mahon Essay Prize was established by Sir Denis's friends and colleagues in 2010 in honour of his 100th birthday. After Sir Denis's death in 2011, it is now his charitable trust which runs the prize. Other projects involve supporting causes close to Sir Denis's heart, such as helping smaller museums and galleries to organise exhibitions. Recent exhibitions we've supported include Caravaggio, Fashion and Fabrics, here at the Museum of the Order of St John, Beecher Visconti, Drawings and Sketchbooks from the Great War, shown at 48 Millbank in London, and later travelling to the National Gallery of Ireland this year. Ongoing projects include the placement of Sir Denis's archive and library at the National Gallery of Ireland, and of course the sponsorship of this current exhibition, Techno Medioevo.
Thank you, Susanne. And we now welcome Dr. Katie Gottardo, Martin Alusa, Curator of Drawings at the Courtauld Gallery, who will talk about Leonardo da Vinci scientific drawings. Dr. Katie Gottardo.
Thank you, Vieta. Thank you, Suzanne, for inviting me. Good morning to everyone. So, this overview of Leonardo's scientific drawings would not have been possible without the numerous publications that specialists of his work have produced. And in particular, my talk today will, thank you very much, use a lot of the work that Martin Clayton, curator of the Royal Collection, where most of Leonardo's drawings are kept, has done. The drawings by Leonardo da Vinci, which can be safely connected to his artistic projects, form only a small part of his surviving corpus. The remainder, his so-called scientific drawings, were his means of capturing all forms in order to record, comprehend and explain the infinite variety of the human experience. For although he developed a rich and powerful literary style, Leonardo always maintained that an image conveyed knowledge more accurately and concisely than words, and then this was at the heart of his work. Many of his drawings were not made for immediate practical purpose, but as an investigation of form for its own sake or in the pursuit of knowledge. After an early training in the Verrocchio workshop in Florence, by 1483, Leonardo moved from Florence to Milan. There, his interest widened to encompass architecture and engineering, and began to take an interest in theoretical basis of painting, assembling notes towards a treatise on painting that was left unfinished at his death. Leonardo was left-handed and wrote his notes on his drawings in mirror image, from right to left. It is now believed that he probably did not hide the content of his work, as has often been claimed, but more, this was a developmental quirk that he developed in childhood and then continued throughout his life. All of what we know of his incredible knowledge and curiosity for the sciences derives from the many drawings and writings contained in numerous sketchbooks, most of which have been dispersed at the end of the 16th century, and here I show only a small sample. The Codex Leicester contains the studies of dynamics of water compiled when he was in the mid-50s. The manuscript deals with forces of nature on a cosmological scale. It offers numerous practical solutions to real-life engineering, problems that arose during his employment as a consultant engineer. The notes in the Codex, a lifetime's worth of notes, seem to indicate that he planned to publish an illustrated book. Aside from Leonardo's book on painting, the Codex Leicester is the only subject that was systematically studied by his immediate successor and printed before the end of the 19th century. The Codex contains crucial evidence of Leonardo's changing views of the world. These changes were precipitated by his intensive study of the body of the Earth, but before the establishment of the geological sciences. It especially demonstrates how Leonardo maintained that the Moon, like the Earth, has standing waves and its own center of gravity. The solution that he proposed in this connection to explain the source of the Moon's light was similar to the definitive answer given by Galileo a century later. Scholars have in fact suggested that it is very likely that Galileo had access to Leonardo's observations about reflected light, color, and shadow. The artist also hypothesized that the light of the sun reflecting from the uneven surface of the Moon accounts for the Moon's unusual soft luminescence. The Codex Atlanticus, a bound set of drawings and writings, is composed of 12 volumes, and it is the largest of such sets. It comprises 119 leaves, dating from 1478 to 1519. The content covers a great variety of subjects, from light to weaponry to musical instruments, and from mathematics to botany. The codex was gathered by the sculptor Pompeo Leoni, the son of Leone Leoni, who in the late 16th century dismembered some of Leonardo's notebooks. Leonardo also projected to write a treatise on painting that was to encompass every subject that would enable an artist to produce works that were true to nature. Its scope was huge and led him to a whole series of investigations into the appearance of the physical world, including optics, geology, botany, and hydraulics, and most importantly into the subject that most interested the Renaissance man, the human body. Most theories of art in the Renaissance concerned themselves at some stage with human proportion, following the traditional belief in the existence of fixed and harmonious ratios within and between the components of the universe. The search for a canon of ideal beauty was in principle no abstract exercise. In the years around 1490, as part of his research towards his projected treatise on painting and anatomy, Leonardo was deeply interested in proportion, producing at this time his iconic image of the Vitruvian man. A drawing that I'm sure everyone is familiar with, whose outstretched limbs fit into the perfect shapes of both the square and the circle. As he contemplated the writing of these treatises, Leonardo sought a clarity of visual description that was equal to the logic of his empirical observation. Soon he conceived the idea of writing a separate treatise on anatomy, and though like the treatise on painting it was never completed, his anatomical studies came to be the most sustained and brilliant of his many scientific researches. Initially, his studies were aiming to cover all aspects of human anatomy, especially trying to explain the evolution of the body from conception and growth, expression of emotions, nature of the senses, and so forth. But initially, he found difficult to properly study the body in a scientific manner, as vivisection was highly regulated and infrequent, and usually performed on the corpses of criminals. Many of his early drawings, therefore, were a blend of received wisdom, animal, therefore not human dissection, and mere speculation. Leonardo trained in Verrocchio's studio, an artist from Florence, who taught him the principles of his art. This innovative drawing that you see on the screen relates to the basic techniques of proportional division that Leonardo adopted in his earliest horse studies. After producing the outlines of the horse, his master, Verrocchio, identified each joint of movement in the horse's body. He marked these articulations with a small circle and then proceeded to inscribe the measurements. He probably worked from a live horse. He took the head of the horse as the unit of measurement, which was again a Vitruvian concept, and then divided the head in 16 parts, though there are several inaccuracies to be taken into account. Verrocchio's drawing probably was made in preparation for this important commission of the monumental equestrian statue of Bartolomeo Colleoni in Campo Santi Giovanni Paolo in Venice. If it was initially difficult for him to assist a human vivisection, Leonardo was, however, able to dissect animals, and in those drawings we see his earliest, most fruitful observations. His drawings of the foot of a bear, the only large quadruped that walks on the soles of its feet like man, are among his earliest impressive studies. It would not have been difficult for him to have access to such anatomical piece, as bears were kept in captivity and used by street entertainers and for baiting. When he had access to real anatomical limbs, as it's the case of this drawing, his works are extraordinary examples of pure observation. Leonardo was struck by the interpretation of the flexor tendons of the bear's toes, and 20 years later, sorry, I'm having trouble having this working, sorry. When he found the same structure in the hands and feet of man, his work recalled the studies of the bear. In this other drawing of very accurate, sorry, here you go. In this other drawing of very accurate depiction of human legs, which deals with nerves and muscles, it is suggested that Leonardo did dissect a human leg, therefore already in the late 1480s. In the notes on this sheet, he wrote, "I have lifted off the muscle, which is alpha braccio, that is 30 centimeter, and I have uncovered the femoris and adductor canal." Though of course rudimentary, this is the first time that such original research was brought forward to this degree of analysis. In this other work, the subject matter of the studies on the lower part of the sheet is the anatomical comparison on man to horse. According to the 16th century biographer Vasari, Leonardo had also intended to compile a treatise on the anatomy of the horse, which is again now lost. The studies at lower right illustrated the internal anatomy of a horse's legs compared to that of a man. Towards the center, at the bottom, he offered a partial view of the skeleton and muscular structure of the rear legs and tail of a horse, comparing them to the bones and muscular structure of the legs of a man at the extreme lower right, where he drew a partial view of just the skeleton of the lower body of the man. In the winter of 1507-08, Leonardo witnessed the death of a man believed to be over 100 years old, who passed away in the monastery of Santa Maria Nuova in Florence. He performed there a dissection on his body to see the cause of such a swift death. This allowed him to record for the first time ever the cirrhosis of the liver, arteriosclerosis, calcification of the vessels, and coronary vascular occlusion. As was usual throughout the Renaissance, the corpse is posed as if in action, and the muscles imbued with the tension of life. With a few dabs of wash, he captured the shimmer of the connective tissue surrounding and interpenetrating the muscles. The large drawing at upper right shows the trunk with only the skin removed. Leonardo perceived the venous system as a branching system carrying nourishment to the extremes of the body, while the arterial system carried vital spirit. The three diagrams on this drawing have the mention del vecchio, which means the old man in Italian, thus indicating that these observations too were made during the dissection of the centenarian. Leonardo's other early opportunity to investigate the internal anatomy of man came when in 1489 he obtained a human skull. He sawed it in various sections to study the relationship between its external and internal forms, and made a sequence of drawings on the pages of a small sketchbook. Much of his analysis of the skull was based on proportional study. The skull has been sectioned sagittally, then the right half frontally, and the two halves were juxtaposed. And the presentation is masterly, really, and 5 years on, the image is still occasionally used in lectures to medical students. Here, his main concern is the relative depth of the facial cavities. Lacking any evidence, he followed the medieval tradition that the brain contained 3 bulbous ventricles, leading back in a straight line behind the eyes. The ventricles housed the so-called senso comune, the common sense, the intellectual and imaginative faculties, and the memory. The senso comune was the supposed site upon which all the sensory nerves converged. It was thus the center of the man's being. On this drawing, on the skull, he wrote that the cavity of the eye socket and the cavity in the bone that supports the cheek, the nose, and the mouth are of equal depth, and each is as deep as the third part of man's face from chin to hairline. Oh, sorry. Here Leonardo inscribed the drawing, the tree of the veins. It may have been intended to illustrate a treatise on anatomy, to judge from its mere expository style of image and text. It may have also served in the construction of a three-dimensional anatomical model. His main concern here was to demonstrate the relationship of the anatomical organs to the surface of the body. He brought forward the vascular system and the main organs from the plane of the man's external outlines, rather than drawing them as if the body were transparent or in cross-section. From the early 1500s, Leonardo was back in Florence, and from there he traveled through central Italy as a military engineer and map maker. In 1503, he received the commission to paint a large mural of the Battle of Anghiari in the council chamber of the Florentine Republic. This was the most prestigious commission of Leonardo's career and the most dynamic composition that he ever worked on. The fight for the standard, which is now lost, represents a wild struggle between man and horse. And here you see a work by Rubens which records the lost composition. This was the important commission that saw Leonardo painting in competition with Michelangelo, who on the opposite wall painted his Battle of Cascina, also lost and here represented by a later print. Leonardo's composition was 20 meters long and required several meticulous drawings to execute the full composition. The subject led him to return to the study of man and horse. The scientific drawings, and in particular the anatomical studies of his later years, are marked by a change in approach that mirrors the development of his philosophical system, evident in his notes. Before 1510, he interpreted what he saw in light of what he knew. The drawing was the end product of his reasoning. After that date, the drawing will always come first and would be the basis of his investigation on the function of any observed form. In 1510, though already famous in Italy and beyond, his scientific drawings were nevertheless still very little known. But from that year onwards, his access to a medical school in Pavia, in Lombardy, in northern Italy, allowed him to study corpses from close and led him to produce his most refined and precise of his anatomical works. And now let's look at some of his engineering and ingenious machines. In parallel to his anatomical studies, during the 1480s, Leonardo began also his significant scientific studies. He started to assemble a small library and taught himself Latin, because that was the language of all treatises. He began to record observations on light, color, perspective, optics, dynamics, and statics, primarily in terms of mathematical laws and proportional harmonies. This drawing clearly shows how Leonardo's mind would move across a sheet of paper with no distinction between sketches for a painting or a design for an engineering project. His mind would fluidly move from one object to the other, which shows how his interests were widely diverse. The drawing at left shows in the upper section some rapid sketches of the renowned Last Supper, his famous fresco in Milan, one of his most important works and one of the masterpieces of Western art. However, its position on the sheet seems almost to indicate that it was an afterthought on the page. In fact, the artist probably first drew the large diagram about the construction of an octagon on the lower portion of the sheet, then wrote the explanatory notes below, and only later sketched the Last Supper composition. The columns of numbers close to the left border of the sheet may have been a list of daily household expenses, while the verse of the sheet describes mechanical devices for hoisting weights. Sorry. This drawing is related to the commission Leonardo received from Ludovico Sforza il Moro for a colossal bronze sculpture, the so-called Sforza horse, which was never executed, and which was to decorate Ludovico's father's tomb. According to Leonardo's notes and other documents, the horse would have been 31 feet high. The technical feat required to cast such an enormous monument must have seemed impossible, and Leonardo procrastinated for so long and then abandoned the entire commission to Sforza's huge despair. The present sheet shows the model of the Sforza horse upside down in the foundry pit. Leonardo ingeniously thought of lightening the weight of the core by making it hollow. The upper sketch offers a view of the core in hemisection with a reinforcement rod as an armature in place inside. The rest of the sheet is devoted instead to designs for a complex system of multiple furnaces that would be necessary to melt the enormous mass of the bronze. He also did studies for a clock. He was very interested in measuring the time since his very early years, and in Milan he would often visit the Abbey of Chiaravalle to examine the functioning of their famous clock, which not only registered hours and minutes, but also the positions of the moon and the sun. This drawing shows sketches for a clock, and to the left, a modern reconstruction based on Leonardo's own drawing. In this other sheet, the artist laid out a device that would allow a man to fly. As the modern 3D reconstruction shows, Leonardo imagined that the person flying it would have been lying down with his chest on the structure, thus freeing up the legs and arms, which, through a system of ropes, would have moved the whole mechanism and allowed the structure to move. The text gives precise indications about these complex movements and about how the wings would have rotated it. Before the development of moderately reliable mixes of gunpowder in the 16th century, military combat was essentially a manual affair. Treatises abounded with often far-fetched devices intended to give an army a decisive advantage. This drawing shows a number of designs for gun barrels and mortars, the most elaborate of which is mounted with a turntable on an unstable boat. Leonardo adopted a combination of screwed and tooth-wheeled, which would have aimed the mortars very precisely through their short barrel design, and he would have obtained only a broad scatter in that way. The long gun barrels were conceived as fine pieces of engineering. The turntable at the center of the sheet is a cradle for mounting the gun above with two opposed barrels, so that no one could be loaded while the other was being fired. In this other work is a boat with a scythe. Here we go. Which would have been used for a war at sea. This idea came to him from the Roman naval engineering. The idea is that the boat will have an enormous scythe capable of devastating effects, which would have been used to first cut the masts and sails of the enemy's boats, and then subsequently would destroy the whole ship and provoke its sinking. In a famous letter addressed to the ruler of Milan, included in the Codex Atlanticus, Leonardo glorified his extraordinary ability of military engineering, capable of creating extraordinary war machines. The scientist-artist designed a heavy covered military trunk topped by a little tower, from which one could see when the enemy was approaching and where to address the fire. In the lower part, see where I've circled it, There were cannons. Here we go. There were cannons which would have been capable of shooting in all different directions. The lower left design shows the trunk without its top, showing how the artillery inside would have worked, with a complex system of mechanism which connected the wheels. There was room for 8 men to operate it from within using cranks. Follows here a drawing with mortars firing stones or cannonballs, which is on the verso of a drawing with studies for a Leda and the swan and for another horse. Besides military engineering works, Leonardo also did maps for several of his patrons. He entered the service of Cesare Borgia, the illegitimate son of Pope Alexander VI, as well as the character described in Machiavelli's Principe, in 1502. Borgia was increasing his power and presence over much of the territory bordering the Florentine state. The Republic of Florence decided to make him a condottiere, which means a warlord, in order to keep relations peaceful and stable. And it is this political attitude that probably moved the Florentine Republic to send Leonardo to the service of Borgia. At this time, the artist drew several maps, such as this one on the right of the 2 rivers near Florence, showing a stretch of the area immediately west of Florence, situated above the upper edge of the map. Some of the maps he composed are connected with his dreams of building a canal from Florence toward the sea, bypassing much of the Arno, the river going through Florence, which involved the canalization of the river itself above and below Florence, to allow the passage of a relatively larger craft to the environs of the city. It also shows that Leonardo's employment by the Florentine Republic in 1504 was not confined to military matters. Other maps were probably commissioned by the Republic, including accurate maps of the area around Pisa, connected with the siege of the city in 1503 and 4, while others were probably to do with the need to minimize the effects of the Arno's frequent floods. The accuracy of these maps testifies the soundness of his method, for the maps covering a large portion of the countryside cannot have been based solely on his personal measurements, but it may have been dependent on earlier maps for general layout of rivers and cities. I hope this overview of Leonardo's scientific drawings has shown how in his work the artist and the scientist were absolutely intertwined, but also how his quest for knowledge pushed him to go beyond the boundaries of each individual discipline. Thank you.
Thank you. Many thanks, Katie. I would now like to introduce Saskia Rubin, this year's winner of the Denis Mahon Essay Prize. Saskia is a first-year PhD candidate studying history of art at the Courtauld Institute. She has just completed a Michael Bromberg Fellowship in the Prints and Drawings Department at the British Museum. Saskia will be talking about Galileo's ideas and influence upon art. Please welcome Saskia Rubin.
Thank you, Orietta, for the introduction. Techno Medioevo, Age of Future Reloaded, is an exhibition that sees contemporary artists reinterpreting historical subjects using new technologies. The show builds upon a great legacy of cross-fertilization between art and science in Italy. Given the close involvement of the Sir Denis Mahon Charitable Trust with this venture, it seems fitting to take up an example of the art and science theme from Sir Denis's most beloved field, Seicento, Italy. The scientist Galileo was an influential art critic and draftsman, alongside making the technological strides that have cemented his place in history. Galileo's telescopic discoveries and their impact on Roman artistic production will be the focus of my talk today. I will begin by introducing the renowned astronomer and mathematician, exploring some of his key theories and discoveries. I then intend to look at artistic responses to his work through discussing a small selection of key examples. The first is Lodovico Carti's fresco in the dome of the Pauline Chapel of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. It was completed late in 1612. I will then proceed to discuss artworks that promote the alliance between noble patrons and the new science. These include the complex painting of The Astronomers by Niccolò Tornioli, produced for Virgilio Spada soon after Galileo's death in 1642. Who was Galileo? Galileo Galilei was born in Pisa on the 15th of February, 1564. His father was a well-known musician and musical theorist. The family moved to Florence in 1570, and then in 1581, Galileo enrolled at the University of Pisa. Although encouraged by his parents to enter the medical profession, he was unable to resist the allure of mathematics and philosophy, to which he dedicated his life. Galileo never obtained his degree, but spent the years from 1585 building such a reputation that he obtained the chair of mathematics at the University of Pisa in 1589. His discrediting of Aristotle's authority on the laws of motion soon led to his dismissal from Pisa, and from 1592 until 1610, he occupied the chair of mathematics at the University of Padua instead. 1609 was the year that would see Galileo's name soar beyond the skies that fascinated him. Having heard about a recent Netherlandish innovation involving an instrument of magnification, he set about experimenting with lens production himself. By the end of the year, he had invented a telescope capable of 20-fold magnification. The Museum of the History of Science in Florence holds two of his earliest telescopes, here attached to an ornate stand. Using the device, he made a number of revolutionary observations, some of which he recorded through drawings. Chief among those were that the moon's surface is rough and uneven, rather than smooth, as had previously been understood. He discovered 4 moons revolving around Jupiter, which destabilized the notion of Earth as the sole gravitational center around which all things moved. The telescope also revealed many more stars than were previously visible to the naked eye. Straight away, Galileo set about publishing these findings and produced a book entitled Sidereus Nuncius in 1610. Strategically, he dedicated it to the Grand Duke Cosimo II de' Medici and named the moons around Jupiter after the family, coining the so-called Medici stars. These maneuvers propelled him into the Florentine court, and he left his position at the university to become a courtier. In Florence, Galileo made further observations that would upturn scientific discourse irrevocably. He found that Venus also goes through phases, much like the moon. The phases of Venus demonstrated that it revolves around the sun, and the moons of Jupiter made clear that it was the centre of motion in itself. These findings supported the view, expounded by Nicholas Copernicus, that the sun was a fixed point around which the planets of the universe orbited. This heliocentric view has been proposed as early as the 3rd century BC by Aristarchus of Samos. They had not, however, gained true currency until the time of Copernicus. The heliocentric model wholly contradicted the ancient tradition advocated by Ptolemy and Aristotle, the latter of whom produced a work entitled On the Heavens in and around 350 BC. Aristotle held that the planets were carried around the universe in immovable positions related to one another. They were held in place by invisible but solid concentric spheres with the Earth at their centre, as illustrated in this diagram. The notion of fixed distances between the stars and the planet, however, failed to explain the variations in brightness of the planets when viewed from Earth at certain times. As such, Galileo's studies of Venus were better suited to a heliocentric than a geocentric hypothesis. In Galileo's era, the Catholic Church equated investigations into the stars with a foray into the heavens. The notion of the moon as rough and the planets as moving bodies carried connotations of heavenly imperfection. This controversial position was made more acute when Galileo published his observations on sunspots along with illustrations in 1613. He argued that there were spots on or near the sun's surface. The real trouble for Galileo began in 1615 when Inquisition consultants declared Copernican theory to be heretical. A number of books were banned, and Galileo was instructed by the Jesuit Cardinal Robert Bellarmine to abstain from teaching or defending Copernican ideas. Galileo's lucky break came in 1623 when Cardinal Maffeo Barberini became Pope Urban VIII. The Pope had been a supporter of Galileo for over a decade. He gave the scientist permission to write and publish his most brazen Copernican salute yet. The work was entitled The Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, Ptolemaic and Copernican. It was finished in 1630. In order to pass the Florentine censors, which were put in place to ensure that publications did not conflict with scriptures, Galileo needed to present his Copernican theories as hypotheses rather than certainties. The preface to the dialogue was sufficiently non-committal to enable publication, and the book began to appear in Florence in 1632. The dialogue is formatted as a discussion between three figures: Salviati, who stands in for Galileo, Sagredo, who represents an intelligent layperson, and Simplicio, who bursts forth with a series of Aristotelian claims in virtual burlesque. The encounter acquainted to geocentric cosmology being pitted against heliocentric Copernican-based theory. The latter case was bolstered throughout by Galileo's telescopic observations. The book reaches its conclusion with the half-witted Simplicio, who claims that regardless of the appearance of the universe to us mortals, God could have made it in any way he so pleased, and we would still see whatever God had intended. Galileo's discussion to conclude his text in this way was a manoeuvre of unparalleled recklessness. The perspective that reconciled divine intent with scientific theory in this specific fashion was espoused by Urban VIII himself. In one fell swoop, Galileo had equated the Pope with the simpleton who had been the subject of ridicule throughout the dialogue. This act resulted in a case brought by the Inquisition, and Galileo was forced to concede that he had overstated the case for Copernicanism. Although condemned to life imprisonment, he managed to escape such a fate and lived the final decade of his extraordinary life in a villa in the hills above Florence. There was a profoundly visual basis to Galileo's astronomical discoveries, in which the eye, aided by the telescope, was responsible for ushering in new knowledge of the heavens. Furthermore, the findings were recorded and transmitted through drawings and reproductive prints. This kinship between art and astronomy was in fact far from a novel phenomenon. Plutarch, for example, wrote his On the Face in the Moon in the form of a discussion, much like Galileo's dialogue. His characters contemplate the dark and bright patches of the moon, noting that they are thoroughly intertwined with each other, so as to make the delineation of the figure resemble a painting. Galileo himself made a similar analogy when describing the sight of the edges of the moon in the moment when it appears to oscillate. He observed that this phenomenon, now termed libration, looked as if it were a variously illuminated portrait of a woman's face. More broadly, Galileo was deeply committed to the artistic production of his day, forming close relationships with artists, as well as unleashing searing critiques. The seminal text on this topic is Erwin Panofsky's Galileo as a Critic of the Arts. It was first published as a book in 1954 and then released as an updated article in 1956. Galileo was allergic to any artistic development that exuded a whiff of faddishness. He mocked those who pieced together their scientific arguments from snippets of Aristotle through likening them to the artist Giuseppe Arcimboldo and his followers. Arcimboldo had achieved a considerable degree of success in the 16th century, producing portraits and allegorical personifications that constituted an assemblage of related objects in miniature. Here is an example at the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. A personification of summer is composed of the riches of the season, including a garlic bulb, a peach, and a split pod of peas. Another subject of Galileo's disdain was anamorphic imagery, a type of distortion that relies upon the foreshortening that arises from viewing an image at a specific angle. The most famous example on our soil takes the form of the skull in Hans Holbein's Ambassadors of 1533. According to Galileo, anamorphic images show a human figure when looked at sideways and from a uniquely determined point of view, but when observed frontally, they display nothing but a welter of lines and colours from which, if we can make out, if we try hard, semblances of rivers, bare beaches, clouds, or strange chimerical shapes. Other art forms were similarly dismissed, including various types of trompe-l'oeil, intarsia pictures made out of inlaid wood or pietra dura, and the Mexican feather art much in vogue among the Medici. Galileo was a talented draftsman in his own right, as is evidenced by his wash drawings of the surface of the moon from 1609, as well as his election to the lofty Florentine Academy of Design in October of 1614. Many of Galileo's ideas on art are memorialized in his correspondence with his close friend, the artist Lodovico Cardi, also known as Cigoli. The two took lessons in perspective together under the mathematician Ostilio Ricci. These classes were conducted at the home of Bernardo Buontalenti, who was himself a fated architect, engineer, and miniaturist. Cigoli showed unwavering loyalty to Galileo and provided the scientist with carefully drawn observations of the dark patches on the sun. His ultimate tribute to Galileo took the form of a remarkable fresco in the Pauline chapel of Santa Maria Maggiore. It was completed in 1612. When Paul V became Pope in 1605, he set in motion the building and decoration of a chapel to house his own tomb and that of his predecessor, Clement VII. The space would also function as a reliquary chapel for the basilica's precious icon of the Virgin, known as the Salus Populi Romani. Correspondingly, the dome of the chapel depicts the Virgin as Queen of Heaven, wearing robes of red, blue, and gold, and emitting rays of divine light. Mary is joined at the base of the cupola by the 12 apostles, with Archangel Michael opposite her. God the Father occupies the uppermost part of the lantern. The Virgin is presented as she is described by John the Evangelist in Apocalypse, chapter 12, verse 1, clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet. The Virgin of the Apocalypse is also known as the Virgin of the Immaculate Conception, or the Immaculata. That is to say that she was conceived without the stain of original sin, although the matter was somewhat contentious. She has a crown of 12 gold stars above her head and stands upon a lunar globe, which in turn rests on a small bank of clouds that cast a shadow on a coiled serpent below. The scheme was devised by the theologian Tommaso Boccio, who asserted that Mary literally signifies nothing less than the Church. It was his intention that she should appear as the Immaculata, as the Church itself, and equally as the Queen of Heaven. Her crushing of the serpent, with the assistance of Archangel Michael, represents her triumph over sin and death, and by extension, the great triumph of the Catholic Church under Paul V. The most extraordinary feature of this fresco is without doubt the cratered moon upon which the Virgin stands. By 1612, Cigoli was making regular observations through a telescope and gleefully informing Galileo that he could see the moon very well. The religious implications of the Immaculate Virgin atop a conspicuously flawed moon are grave, not least because the moon itself was endowed with the symbolism of the Virgin. God was thought to have created a perfect cosmos, a notion that aligned tidily with Aristotelian theory. The sun, being the most radiant and noble of the celestial bodies, signified Christ. Theological texts of the Renaissance, variously called Christ the Sun of Righteousness, with a U, the new sun, and invincible sun, again with U's. The moon, as a symbol of the Virgin, was often called the Queen of Heaven. It was thought to consist of a crystalline substance without stain or without macula, much like the Virgin. From the medieval period onwards, when the moon appeared in tandem with the Virgin, it was a perfectly smooth orb or crescent. Of the infinite examples that one could select, we have here Guido Reni's Immaculate Conception. Against this legacy, Cigoli's pitted moon is a stark outlier. We should, however, acknowledge that the artist allowed his aesthetic predilections to trump scientific veracity. The moon is positioned at a 90-degree angle to its true configuration through the telescope. The crescent should be vertical rather than horizontal. Strangely, we have no record of shockwaves rippling through the Vatican when the chapel frescoes at Santa Maria Maggiore were unveiled. On the contrary, in May of 1611, Galileo was welcomed to Rome by a number of illustrious cardinals and prelates, not to mention Paul V himself. Stephen Ostroff has reasoned that the key to this acceptance was a theological tradition rooted in the writings of Nicholas of Lyra from the early 14th century. His texts continued to be read in Cigoli's day. The Franciscan teacher argued that the woman standing on the moon also signifies the church, militant in its victory over heresy. This example illustrates the capacity of the church to exercise some flexibility when handling the discoveries of the new science. One might say that the incentive to adapt could only have been boosted by Cigoli's incredible creation. It seems to be confirmed, then, that Galileo's observation of the imperfect surface of the moon was not his most controversial proposition. After all, his fall from grace at the hands of the Inquisition was linked mostly to his Copernican views on a heliocentric universe. Prior to this incident, he had enjoyed consistent and intimate patronage by the ruling elite in Rome and Florence, starting with Cosimo II de' Medici. I would now like to address the special place of patronage in commissioning works of art that celebrated Galilean advances. Apart from Cosimo II, key figures included Urban VIII, the papal nephew Cardinal Francesco Barberini, and his secretary Catiano dal Pozzo. Cardinal Francesco Maria del Monte, best known for his zealous commissioning of works by Caravaggio, offered by Galileo's telescope in 1610, and later his microscope in 1620. Part of the motivation underlying the support of both artists and scientists was the potential for their innovations to elevate the status and genius of the patron himself. Art and science therefore occupied cherished positions in courtly life. Commissioning reproducible objects, such as prints and medals, which could be printed or minted by the thousand, allowed papal families to widely advertise their position at the forefront of artistic and scientific innovation. As discussed earlier, Galileo played up to the conceit of courtly bombast through naming the 4 satellites around Jupiter Medicean stars in his Sidereus Nuncius. The iconography of the Medicean stars was immediately adopted to promote the virtue of the Medici. Take, for example, this oval medal by Gaspare Mola, which was struck around 1610 and commemorates Cosimo II along with the discovery of the Medici stars. On one side, we have Jupiter sitting on a cloud with the 4 stars above. he is presented as a direct equivalent to the effigy of Cosimo II on the other side. Nine years later, Jacques Caillot was commissioned by Cosimo II to etch a magnificent fan. The print depicts a mock battle carried out annually on an artificial island in the middle of the river Arno. The Florentine guilds of the weavers and dyers would enact a fight surrounded by fireworks and crowds of spectators. 1,000 impressions of the fan were made, of which 500 were cut out, pasted onto board and distributed to spectators. A figure perched on the elaborate frame to the right holds a fan much like the one on which it is depicted. On the left, a prominent gentleman cranes in on the action, watching the event through a telescope. In this way, Cosimo was allying himself directly with Galileo's invention and ingeniously engaging in self-promotion via a functional work of art. The biography of the Roman Virgilio Spada was not tied so intimately to Galileo as Cosimo II. However, he too commissioned a work of art intended to highlight his knowledge and kinship with the new science. He commissioned the Astronomers between 1643 and 1645 from his favourite painter, Niccolò Tornioli. The composition presents, in lively chiaroscuro, the fundamental dichotomy between heliocentric and geocentric models of the universe, as laid out in Galileo's dialogue. The painting features accurately depicted scientific instruments, including a celestial globe, a set of compasses, and a telescope. Virgilio was an eager collector of curiosities, and his museum included scientific instruments, including the telescope. His tentative support for Galileo in the aftermath of the latter's death is demonstrated by the discreet presence of the scientist at the far right corner of the composition. The figural group in Galileo's half of the canvas clearly espouses the Copernican system, unlike the group on the left. Tornioli unites characters from a vast temporal span. A representation of the aged Aristotle appears second to the left, proffering an illustration of concentric spheres bound within a weighty tome. He is joined by a warrior wearing an exuberantly plumed helmet who has variously been described as Alexander the Great or Ptolemy. While Ptolemy would be a reasonable bet, owing to the harmony between his theories and those of Aristotle, Alexander the Great considered Aristotle a treasured mentor. Julia Martina Weston, the author of the most recent article on this painting, draws attention to the likeness between this canvas and other depictions of Alexander the Great, such as Pietro da Cortona's Battle of Alexander versus Darius of 1644. The central figure, meditating between the groups and gesturing towards the multiple phases of the moon, is often thought to be Copernicus. The young man towards the right, who peers through a telescope, has not been identified. His pose strangely sees him homing in on the celestial globe, rather than the sky for which the telescope was invented. This has been the subject of some scholarly discussion. In 1952, Federico Zeri compared it to Caravaggio's Narcissus from the end of the 16th century. Could this be a witty acknowledgement of the narcissism attached to courtly sponsorship of arts and sciences? The presentation of diplomatic and courtly gifts certainly provided an opportunity to impress the recipient with the donor's enlightened intellectual prowess. Gifts often involved either science-themed artworks or precious tools. Lorenzo de' Medici, for example, famously offered Guercino's Atlas to the Capponi family in 1646. This work shows a globe with the constellations of Libra, Scorpio, and Sagittarius. The Medici family, as we know, was closely involved in the Galileo affair. Thank you. By the 1660s, the Medici under Cosimo III were eager to revive the potent symbolism of the Medicean stars but attempted to distance their source from the disgraced Galileo. This visual campaign takes spectacular form in a print by Franz Speer after Ciro Ferri in 1664. Here, Cosimo is represented as Augustus. Above him is the god Jupiter, metaphorically standing in for the planet. Jupiter closely resembles Cosimo's father Ferdinand too, and is surrounded by the 4 cardinal virtues. These virtues are embodied by the former Medici Grand Dukes, and each have Medician stars shining over their heads. This beautiful and undeniably grandiose print seems like the ideal emblem with which to end this talk. Well, it's not ended quite yet. I'll just continue nonetheless. As we have seen, Galileo's discoveries gave rise to a plethora of extraordinary images. The visual nature of his discoveries allowed for an exquisitely harmonious joining of the arts and the sciences. We must not forget that Galileo's personal interest in art, manifest in lively communication with Cigoli and others, allowed him to shape the artistic production of his day in more ways than one. The desire of the papal nobility to advertise their position at the forefront of scientific developments led them to invest copiously in technology as well as paintings and prints. The friction between astronomy and scripture, as well as Galileo's wavering reputation, however, led to an ambivalent embrace of the flawed heavens. Thank you.
Thank you, Saskia. It is with great pleasure that we now welcome Professor Marcello Pecchioli, curator, founder and leader of Techno Medioevo and the association Age of Future. Professor Marcello Pecchioli.
Good morning. Okay, good morning, and a special thanks to Orietta and Suzanne for the invitation. This one? Okay. Okay. The title is a few words about Techno Medioevo. On the splendid occasion of this conference around the 10th of Techno Medioevo and recording history, I want to introduce some topics that continue from and implement the arguments made in both the exhibition, still on view here of the Museum of the Order of St. John in London, and the writing connected to the Techno Medioevo in the book that I edited, Cronache dal Techno Medioevo, Mimesis Editore. The meaning of Techno Medioevo is explained in the Techno Medioevo Reloaded catalogue, and I would like to point out that our analysis that proposes at least 2 new elements. The first is a hypothesis that the historical Middle Age was at once a poverty-stricken and science-free era, at which time a whole series of technology emerged from mnemonics to the combinatorial arts Lulliana, from the construction of illuminated codes to John Dee attempt to build combinatorial machine based on the geometry of Platonic solids, as well as an architecture and urban master plan developed on a European scale with fortification, castle and church organized and planned by the Knight Templars. The second element concerns our attitude to document an event reading relating to Italian and European Middle Age and Renaissance. Along this line, and we note this in the artwork on display, the idea of history we have introjected must be modified. We should talk about the augmented history, as such along the line of what is happening in technology. Here, immersive reality, augmented reality, virtual reality, mixed or hybrid reality are beginning to show us that the Popperian World 1, the world of events and the events of daily life, is about to clash with the virtual world, which offered the simple promise of digital pastime to nerds and video games enthusiasts. Indeed, the virtual world is slowly colonizing almost all areas of our knowledge and daily life, and above all, is demonstrating that immersive virtual reality is going to replace perceived reality under our very noses. It is as a virtual universe existed, hidden in each of the social areas that we frequent. In some respect, this is a revenge of the technological surrealism that has waited for the tools we have today to come out and reveal itself. I remember a sequence in 1983 film Videodrome, written and directed by David Cronenberg. In which Max Ren, masterfully acted by James Wood, was asked to wear a virtual reality helmet developed by Canadian multinational The Spectacular Optical Corporation. Ren cites some words attributed to Lorenzo de' Medici, which speak at the eyes and how our vision is the mirror to our soul. This quote tells us that we are testing in our studies, research, in related events, conference, exhibition, as in the case of the commercial Videodrome device launch in the film, is the Florentine Renaissance. There seems to exist a gigantic and supported technological potential nested in the distant past, and the task we have as historian, philosopher, and researcher is to show the world what was hidden behind the cultural mantle of many different periods, in our case, the Middle Age and the Renaissance. One of the characteristic errors of previous studies into history has been a poor understanding about cultural tools, technology, scientific hypotheses, and lifestyle. Without going into too much detail, I would like to mention at least two scholars who have tried to recover this type of knowledge. One of them is the heretical Sumerologist Zacharias Sitchin. He has dedicated his life to the study of Sumerian civilization and its gods, the Anunnaki, with an output of about 20 volume and essay translated in the main world language, and also possessing an expertise in ancient Mediterranean culture, as well as having proposed some hypothetical revision of the main pre-Columbian civilization. The other scholar I would like to mention is Mauro Biglino, an antiquarian and biblical text translator. For many years he worked to the Pauline Library, and more recently he has been the proponent of a radical revision of the Bible, the Old Testament, and the canonical and apocryphal Gospel, as more recently also texts related to ancient Greece and the description we can find in classical poems such as Iliad and Odyssey. We could mention many others who shared the research goals of the Techno Medioevo project. In fact, since our era left behind the Gutenberg printing press, the classic book printing technology that gave us the way we read the text and image, we have taken the path of digital technology, computer-assisted technology, multimedia and hypertext. A new world was opened before our eyes, an absolute new world in which many of the parameters we have used, even to read about historical events, have changed. This is thanks to the tumultuous development of new technology. The parameters by which we use to judge, for example, the primary population, those without written language, have to change because of the fluidity created by new digital technology and the way they have surpassed the traditional way of reading derived from Gutenberg press. We can no longer criticize culture that are inequipped for writing in the digital age, we are more open to other ways of communicating. With the advent of multimedia and the age of hypertext, new applied technology has blown away our standard vision of the past, from cultural anthropology to paleoethnology, discipline concerned with the study of primary population. Carlo Severi, a pupil of Claude Lévi-Strauss, has rightly noted these points about the complex ritual of many populations in North America, such as Dakota Indian, in this book, Il percorso e la voce, The Path and the Voice, in Audi 24. In several books, an even more disruptive hypothetical is presented. In the writing system of Dakota Indian, there is a way of depicting hunting or war scene, dressing the Dakota warrior with the weapons, principal bow and arrows. Severi describes how the warrior were depicted in small portable Bible. What does this example mean? It surely like an earthquake to the perception we have about technology, scientific progress and history. Furthermore, the evolutionary and progressive cycle that our society believes in, and the belief that our technology continue to improve and outperform an historical precedent, should be revised. If we deal with other civilizations, their evolution and historical periods, as we have noted from these few examples, that will be many surprises for us. For convenience, let's say the story that we tend to believe about linear evolutionary progress, work instead as a geometric object in topological space. Imagine that the paradox of evolution are hidden from you, the horizon of positivistic history disappear, and we are left to explore and find, hidden in the recess of the object, many complex and hidden technology treasure. From my point of view, this treasure can be found and brought to fruition by using the best and more important epistemological and techno-scientific configuration, and modeling at our disposal as men belonging to the most evolved civilization of all time, the 21st century. With the advent of artificial intelligence and robotics, we seem to be on the verge of an unprecedented conceptual revolution. It's said that we are reaching a point of no return, the advent of singularity time, in which machine, robots and computer may begin to emulate us. In fact, they are already doing it. Indeed, we are getting to the point where artificial intelligence assisted by algorithms, neural networks, deep learning, machine learning, and so on, could make the evolutionary leap that we fear so much and overcame the characteristic of human intelligence and take control of the whole human race. Many scenarios for worldwide domination by intelligence artificial have been thought of by scientists, writers, filmmakers, futurologists, economists, and sociologists. They preach that one of the first things strong artificial intelligence could make is an evolution in operational performance, producing a change worldwide in almost all sectors of social life, with the intelligent artificial obtaining control over many social areas, from monetary institutions to database, networks, web, telecommunication, big data, politics, military institutions, commerce, didactic, school research. This scenario is found in films like Trashness, directed by Wally Pfister, in which Johnny Depp plays the electronic avatar of a supercomputer with hyperhuman, almost divine characteristic. This figure proved to be destructive and megalomaniac, attempting to replicate itself in all the computers in the world. The same concept can be found in R, written and directed by Spike Jonze. where humans can communicate with an intelligent artificial verbally, a kind of very advanced Siri. The feminine artificial intelligence power is again global and pervasive and makes one think of a society that could be governed almost exclusively by artificial intelligence system, or in any case in which our dialogue with this system will be conflictual and problematic. I ask myself, if there existed in history a period like the one we are living through, with the characteristic of a strong artificial intelligence that dominates the terrain, where should we turn to? The Templars came to mind, and thanks to their special status and military training, they constituted an enigma for their contemporary that remain for us too. The assumption is the Templar, slide, and the lady on the unicorn, okay? Even more than the other monastic warrior order of the time, the Hospitaller, the Teutonic Knights, the Knights of Malta, the Knight of Christ, and so on, represent the equivalent of a strong artificial intelligent behavior, albeit in an era in which there were neither electronics, nor computer, nor artificial intelligence system, nor network. On 3 continents, the Templars simultaneously developed environment, urban and architecture, planning, building castle, church and fortification. This factor implies a control of environment complexity that is difficult to understand, let alone replicate, even today. The use of exotic and alien technology for architecture and urban planning meant that they were able to overcome all manner of construction and engineering problems. For example, their church and cathedral construction method lead on daring architectural solution, which we find in the building that came down to us. Equally in war, the Templars' military and strategic technique were equal to those of the best present-day special force, with training and strategy equal to of the US Navy SEAL or Marine. During the Crusade in the Holy Land against the Turk, Mamluk and Arab, the Templars had a refinement in warfare and fighting. The Templar also had knowledge of secret ideas handed down in the Holy Land from very ancient time and used, for example, in ciphering. Equipment such as astrolabe, an exotic technology developed by Egyptian and unknown in the West, was used for navigation. The Templar also possessed very detailed nautical and geographical maps, which show a surprising extensive knowledge of cartographic principles for that time, which were then applied in transatlantic route. In addition, the most important explorer from Magellan to Vasco da Gama, to Christopher Columbus, may be considered a Templar or very close to the warrior monk brotherhood. We talk about travelers who discovered America or circumnavigate the Earth and the many continents, acts that were so complex and daring that they might, by comparison, consider the times to today's NASA space mission. The unearthed geographical horizon, new continents and cultural discovery over time, which hugely important results from commercial traffic, sea routes and the future geopolitics of the planet Earth. Through this type of reading, the Templar emerge as an equivalent to a strong artificial intelligence. It is quite paradoxical and disconcerting, and it goes to corroborate this thesis that our past history must in many respects be rewritten. This means that technology we have developed over time might be viewed as mental, real, technological, symbolic. These things we have developed can take us through an ever-increasing history toward a very remote future. This future is a dialogue with the culture and memory of the past in a profound space-time loop, and it opens up a new horizon, potentially offering guidance in a new Felix era, the golden age of human understanding. We eagerly wait our final arrival at the completion on 21st century techno-humanism.
Hello. Well, thank you for the kind introduction. It's a pleasure for Flatham House to be working on this project. I have a lot of slides, so I'm hoping there's going to be quite a bit to look at. And I thought to give a little bit of context on my talk, I would give a little bit of background of where I'm coming from in my practice. So I may have to sort of stand with my hand like this because I've got so many slides. I graduated from the Royal College of Art some time ago, and I went on to tutor there for 4 years, and I'm currently a cross-department tutor there, and I work at Chelsea as well. And a lot of the students, I do classes at Flatham House with them. I then went on to work at a place called Wising Arts Centre in Cambridgeshire, which is a site for research, for artist practice and residencies. And I worked there for nearly 5 years, programming retreats, workshops, and there's the farmhouse where artists would live. We worked with artists such as Gustav Metzger, who was a contemporary of John Latham's, worked with him on the Destruction and Art Symposium in 1966, and he stayed with us for 6 months in 2014. This is one of the exhibitions that I made there, which looked at antiquated projections on the future, and another show which included work by John Latham, which was really my introduction to John Latham's work, research introduction, called the Starry Rubric Set, which looked at pseudoscientific models of space and time. This was an associated program I made with the artists Ed Atkins and James Richards and Gil Young, and used a phosphorescent surface as the basis for the projection. So the screen itself held the light from the projector. And this was a project I did with the industrial noise band Maria and the Mirrors, who I introduced to the American artist Karen Sitter, and they collaborated on this multimedia installation, which was shown at the Institute of Contemporary Arts on the Mall. Then went on to do a lot of music programming. This is the music festival I used to do for Wising, and when I went independent, continued that with Dalston Music Festival, experimental music programming, collaborations with artists, such as this one with Beatrice Olabarrieta, exhibitions like this one with Agata Medeska and Coco Crampton, and more recently an exhibition that was based on my thesis. I wrote about boredom, and this was at Nilo, the Contemporary Arts Centre in Reykjavik. Included a work by, a new iteration of the work by John Baldessari, I Will Not Make Any More Boring Art, where the students of the Icelandic Art Academy wrote this across the gallery walls for the whole duration of the show. So, after that brief introduction, hopefully brief, I'm going to move on to what I'm here to talk about at the moment, which is the institution Flatham House. And perhaps a little bit of that cross-discipline kind of background will help understand my place within this institution. So I started working for Flatham House in 2015, and I work as the curator and the director of the space. Flatham House is a very unusual institution in that it's a house museum, but also a contemporary art space. it was the home of the, as Orietta already introduced, the home of the radical, very experimental and often in his lifetime overlooked artist John Latham. And John was born in 1928 in Maramba, Zambia, what was then Livingstone in northern Rhodesia. And he moved to Britain as a young boy to boarding school. He joined the war effort for World War II at the age of 19, became a captain in the Navy, saw 2 of his ships sunk whilst he was still on board, and was also involved in the recapture of Italy. Whilst in Italy, he saw an exhibition of the stolen works, the works that Mussolini stole in Rome, and in front of this El Greco painting had this revelation that he wanted to be an artist. One can only presume the trauma that he'd been through must have kind of helped come to this conclusion. He came to Britain again and studied at Chelsea, and after a long career, moved to this house in 1985 in Peckham in South East London on a residential street. It's quite an unusual location. So it remained 210 Belden Road for most of that time, but in 2003 he renamed it Flat Time House after his personal cosmology of flat time, and he declared it a conceptual sculpture and anthropomorphized the space and dedicated each of the rooms the attributes of a different part of the body. So in this plan, in small type, I'll read it for you, it says the face, the hand, the brain, the body event, and the hand. So the face is the most striking aspect of this building when you first come across it on the street. And it's a book sculpture that is cantilevered through the piece of glass, supported by the pane of these 2 large books with the pages interleaved. The next space is the mind. Then there is what is essentially an office space and housed the archive. This he dedicated to the brain. A corridor space called the shift. Then this room here, which is obviously a kitchen and a living area, which a lot of people don't expect when coming into the house. This he called the body event. Then at the rear of the building, under the skylight, what used to be his studio, which he called the hand. And at the back, we also have some studios where artists work, in the garden. So the spaces as you saw them there aren't what they looked like when John Latham lived there. The space has changed a lot, and this is partly because John Latham was someone who didn't believe in the notion of heritage. He thought of the world as constantly changing. He considered the universe in a way that was based on time rather than space, and he thought that nothing was static. And so it's logical that it would be contradictory to hold the place as a time capsule. So there you can see the hand in 2005. This was the living area in 2005. You can see it's quite messy. It's obviously lived in. This was his workstation in the corridor, and you can see here this is the hand as a studio space. These are actually quite useful when we're doing conservation work, because we can find materials on the shelves and see exactly what paints you were using. So rather than this being a museum of John Latham, Flat Time House is really a museum of his ideas, and it operates a conceptual space, which hopefully you might begin to understand as I continue. So the Mind Gallery, when John Latham lived there, well, rather for the last 3 years of his life, from 2003 to 2006, he selected 4 works to put in this space, and he set up a little camp chair, and he would sit in this space and talk to anyone who came in about his ideas, and he'd try and convey this cosmology, this so far confusing perhaps to you notion of flat time. And people would come around the world. In our archive, we've got correspondence with figures such as Noam Chomsky, Stephen Hawking, with popular musicians such as Pink Floyd and John Lennon, and with classical musicians such as Erwin Laszlo. And so he, as well as many, obviously, artists in conceptual art. And so he really had a broad area of interest, and would discuss these ideas with many people. And so we still have these 4 works on display, and we keep them there almost as learning aids or teaching tools, as John did. And I often have to do this introduction to flat time because people don't know what it is. John Latham's known as a very difficult artist. That's partly because of the way he used to talk about his work. He didn't believe in rational forms of communication. He wanted people to think for themselves. And so, really, to understand his work, you need to understand the language of his artwork. And when you understand that language, then it's easier to understand what he's trying to convey intuitively. So, as I go on, if some of the things I'm talking about don't make sense, don't worry about it. And also, I always like to kind of give the caveat that if John Latham was listening to me talk about this now, he would almost certainly disagree with me and say that I was explaining this wrong. There's an inherent contradiction that I'm rationalizing something which is intended to be understood intuitively. And if John Latham was still alive, these ideas would have changed. He was refining these ideas all the way through his life. Recently, gravitational waves were discovered, and John Latham always suggested that that would never happen. Now that they've been discovered, he would have changed some of his ideas to reflect this. So, this is a work that he made in 2003 with the purpose of communicating this. And we have 2 planes. On the left, there is a plane of glass, and on the right, a white plane made of foam board. And this is where it's useful to understand the language of materials from John Latham. So John started using glass in 1987. This is a controversial work called God is Great, which uses glass, the Bible, the Torah, and the Quran. This is a work called They're Learning Fast, which is a piranha tank with live piranhas. And this is another God is Great work, which is in the Tate collection. And for John, glass is a material that is symbolic. He always uses materials in a symbolic way, and glass is symbolic of nothing. So that might seem a little bit odd to have something that is symbolizing nothing, but for John, this is very important. When he was referring to nothing, he was referring to no time and no space, and this also equates to the atemporal, that which is outside of time. So if you keep that in your mind for one moment, I'm now going to talk about the white plane. For John, he called this the least event. So you can think of this as being the shortest duration that there can be. So again, this seems theoretical, and there can always be a shorter duration, but within theoretical physics and high-energy physics, there are actually definable and measurable shortest durations. And the duration which Latham found interesting and useful was the Planck time. The Planck time is a unit which is the duration it takes for a beam of light to cross the diameter of an electron whilst in a vacuum. This is a very, 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 very short duration. And when things are operating on a duration less than a Planck time, we move out of the realm of general relativity and into quantum physics, where things can be simultaneously in two places at once and can move in time from the future to the past. So time as we understand it, as something going in one direction, doesn't operate anymore. So any durations over a Planck time are in the realm of general relativity, and as such are in a realm that humans can understand subjectively. Does this make sense? Yeah, it's reassuring. There's a few people nodding. You may understand this much better than I do, actually. So what we have on the left is nothing, and on the right, a very, very small something. So then it's interesting and useful to think of what John Latham's model for the universe, the model of the universe that he ascribed to. And he ascribed to a cyclical universe, what's often called the Big Crunch theory, whereby the universe comes from a Big Bang and expands, 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 comes to a point of maximum extent, and then begins to compress. And it gets smaller and smaller and smaller till it gets to a non-dimensional point. There is another Big Bang, and you get a new universe. So rather than the Big Bang being a point in which everything comes to existence, it is rather a transition point from one state to another state. So then the glass plane becomes more interesting. Rather than it being a nothing before something, it is a transition point between two states. So, as well as being no time and being the atemporal, we can think of it as being a transition point, a paradigm shift from one universe to the next, or John Latham would also think of this as from one mode of understanding to another mode of understanding. So this, he thought of the Big Bang being an obvious paradigm shift. Another would be when Einstein wrote the theory of relativity, where one understanding of the universe went to one side and a new unified model came around within the history of science. Within the history of art, he saw a relationship between developments in theoretical physics with developments in contemporary art, and he saw Robert Rauschenberg's white monochromes in 1951 as being a kind of white nothing in the centre of the 20th century, similar to Hawking's black holes or Einstein's theories. And in his own art, he saw a paradigm shift occurring in 1954, and that is when he made his first spray paint work. So before this, he'd been working in very painterly style, very flat paintings, influenced by El Greco. And with this new technique, he found that he was able to impose a lot of his ways of thinking into the actual making of the work. So previously, he had seen a disconnect between what he'd been trying to deal with conceptually and the expression this was finding, the way he was communicating this. And his main influences were two scientific figures. Clive Gregory, who was an astronomer and the founder of the University of London Observatory, and his partner Anita Kozin, who was a psychologist and sometimes described as a parapsychologist, an animal behavioralist. So really interested in the outer limits of psychology and its relationship to science. And they had developed a theory that they described, that they named O structure, which was an attempt at a unifying theory of the universe. This was one of a number of kind of theories around this time. Again, I often think that this is down to the horrors of the Second World War, potentially trying to find limits to rational thought and unifying models for how to go forward. And John Latham had been discussing with them a universe based on time rather than on space. When they asked him to do a mural for their house in 1954, rather than doing it in his painterly style, he decided to use a spray gun that he'd been using for work in the garden and made one of his first murals. This isn't a picture of that mural, but a work around the same time called For Mission. And for him, suddenly, the making of the work itself became an event. And so the practice was becoming the ideas that he was dealing with. The points of spray are almost like moments in time. And so for the work that we have on display at Flattone House, this is called Organism Somewhere. And if you look at this detail, you can think of this as this instantaneous work, this least event, this short duration, but also potentially aesthetically as this could be the entire universe in negative. It could be the tiniest particle under microscope, or it could be an organic structure. And you can see that he has used his thumb to kind of move this, to kind of introduce a human presence within the work. So then we come to the third work in this series, in the first space. And this is a work called the book relief triad, or sometimes the Karamazov triad. And this is more akin to the type of work that John is most famous for. And these are his book relief sculptures, where he uses books cut in half, burnt, covered in plaster, and stuck to canvas, sometimes in a sculptural manner. And books are incredibly important for John Latham because of the way that they can be made into events. Just going to go back. For him, the book is a symbol for received opinion. So you can think of the book as a receptacle of knowledge, and John wanted people to challenge received opinion. And the influence that this had on a lot of artists is an image by the work John Stayzecker. He saw a work at the Tate when he was a young boy by John Latham, still in the collection, this work, Film Star. And when he went to see this work again, he'd seen that it was a different colour. And this is because John used to go to the space and change the pages of the book. And so when he had this realization, he always says that this was like a revelation on what you could do with art. And so these books contain this time, this event nature, but also are a receptacle of received opinion. And John was quite radical in his questioning of this. This is a statement from when he was teaching at Central St. Martin's. Senior academic institutions have been defrauding the public and students for 300 years. They are not concerned with education, still less with the truth. They are run for the benefit of the staff. He was saying that as a tutor. And with this work here, which is another famous work of his called Art and Culture, Spit and Chew from 1966, he got his students together and took the book Art and Culture by Clement Greenberg out of the library. At this time, this book was really a kind of tome on how to make good art, essentially. And at St. Martin's, that was a particular, as the home of Anthony Caro, who was championed by Greenberg, this was quite a controversial statement because he got the students to tear out a page of the book each, eat it, and then spit it out into a vial. then John Latham, using an enzyme, who put that in the vial with all of this spit and gunk and pulp, then distilled the spirit of this and created a pure spirit of art and culture from that, which he then returned to the library and promptly lost his job. So you can see that his acts were deliberately provocative, and perhaps one of the more provocative works are his Scoob Tower ceremonies, where he would take towers of books, usually the Encyclopedia Britannica, as a symbol for all received opinion, hierarchical forms of knowledge, and burn them, usually in symbolic spaces, such as outside the British Museum, outside Senate House. And this is seen as obviously a destructive act, but for John Latham, I think, if rational thought is leading to the horrors of the Second World War, you can see that there is a space to question received opinion. And this isn't a rejection of all knowledge. He would often cite different authors and philosophers specifically and their importance to him, but rather he is suggesting that we just don't take this blindly. So we can see the face of Flattime House in this kind of knowledge of what the book is for John Latham. Here, the pages of the book are interleaved, which means that you can't read the book. So he's rejecting a logical, rational reading, and we need to approach it in an intuitive way. So then to come back to, with that knowledge, to come back to the Karamazov triad, and we can see that there are 3 books, and they symbolically relate to the figures in Dostoevsky's book, The Brothers Karamazov. There's 3 brothers, Mitya, Ivan and Alyosha. The elder brother was very instinctive, the middle brother was very rational and scientific in his approach, and the younger brother was very intuitive. And for John Latham, he was interested in these models as the ways that humans behave within society and the ways that they relate to all external influences. So we can think of these as being the instinctive, as being needing to eat, sleep, excrete, all the bodily requirements that a human has to procreate, to keep the species going, everything that comes from the oldest parts of our brain. And we need to do these regularly on a daily basis. Then there is rational thought. If you're existing purely based on instinct, then you probably wouldn't be received well in society. And rational thought is the kind of the ability to communicate, to formulate thoughts and to explain them to someone else, to have a conversation. Bureaucracy, paying your taxes, operating within society in a way in which others can also exist. And for John Latham, this is a longer time base. This requires consideration of more things than just purely how to stay alive till tomorrow. Then what he thought was neglected in society was what was symbolized by the uppermost canvas, that of Alyosha. And this he thought of as being what he called reflective, intuitive thought. And this was something he thought was the longest time base. Being able to think purely outside of what is benefit to yourself. And this he saw as being similar to creative practice, and he saw art as fitting in this kind of area, perhaps alongside experiences such as Zen. And this was something he thought was neglected within society. He didn't like to use the term artist. He devised a term called the incidental person, because he thought this mode of thought wasn't purely available to artists, and that everyone in society was able to think in a reflective, intuitive manner, but often it wasn't used. So I'm going to come to the 4th work in the space now, and this is the time-based roller. So this is an activated kind of mechanical, kinetic work. And John thought of this as a score for the universe. And in this work, it brings together the ideas from the other works as this kind of diagram of 3 different modes of time. So it's quite small here, but what you have is, on an electric switch, a roller across the top, which activates and pulls the canvas upwards. Across the top of it, you've got a number of letters, A, M, P, Q, R, U, Z, on a board with a barrel upon it. And there's also spray on the front of the canvas, which you only see at the barrel of the mechanism. We can see the reverse, through the reverse of the canvas, the front of the spray. So alongside we have this kind of diagram in John Latham's very difficult language that uses pure mathematics and language from physics. We have this explanation that's very hard to understand. But you can see from this work, this 1972 work that's at the Tate, when it's activated, the canvas goes up and down and up. And so what you have is a model of passing time as we normally understand it, something that goes forwards, something that's always progressing. But then you also have another model of time, which I have been hinting at whilst I was talking about the Karamazov triad, and this is the time base. And this goes from the shortest duration, the least event, so if you remember the white plane, the Planck time. So at A, you have the shortest duration in the universe, and then as you go along, you get longer and longer and longer durations. To get the middle, this is point M. This is the shortest duration perceivable to a human. So he would think of this as 30th of a second. You can think of this as similar to a frame rate for a cine camera, 24 frames a second. If it goes over this, you can see the individual frames. If you go below this, it's just constant movement. Sorry, vice versa. And then as durations get longer, you get to point P. So this is instinctive behavior. You get into the realm of human experience. So this is needing to eat every day, and etc. This is just staying alive. So this is the time base in which humans operate on an instinctive level. And then as you move along to Q, this is rational thought. This is like a generation, 30 years. This is thinking about the medium term, consideration of not just what's going to keep you alive, but what is good for society to an extent. This is government proposing certain things to a populace, them deciding what they want, and then selecting a political party based upon that. This is how society operates in most occasions. And then the longer duration that he thought was neglected, that of reflective, intuitive thought. Beyond that, we get U, which is the duration that the universe has been in existence. And then beyond that, point Z, that is off the canvas, and that is the duration of the universe at maximum extent, or all possible universes. So you can think of this as being, this is on the barrel outside the canvas, so you can think of this as being like the glass plane. This is the nothing, this is outside of time. It's atemporal because it's constantly behind the canvas. Is this still making sense? Still with me? Okay. So, I mean, so far, what I'll do now is maybe just a quick run-through of the house so it kind of makes sense. Because what you have here is a symbol for received opinion, which transitions through a glass plane, which you can think of as a symbol of a paradigm shift, into this space, which is the mind, a symbol of reflective, intuitive thought, which depends upon the brain, which is a space of rational thought, and then that's dependent on the body event, the symbol for instinct, because if you're purely rational without instinct, you'll just die. So this so far seems quite esoteric. It seems quite eccentric. But what is maybe surprising to understand is that there have been actual real-world applications for some of these ideas. And some of his ideas have already affected government policy. And for some time during the 1970s, he was directly working through the artist placement group that he founded with his partner Barbara Stavini, or rather, Barbara Stavini founded, and John Latham was a founder member. They worked directly with the British government for some duration in the 1970s. So one of these, before I get onto the artist placement group, one thing to kind of think about here is what applications could long durational thinking have on society. And John saw the position of the incidental person as being someone that was able to operate within areas of society thinking in a rational manner and perhaps bring up possibilities that, or questions that wouldn't otherwise be able to be raised. An example of this is this work, which it's difficult to, perhaps for some people to understand as an artwork, but if you think that John Latham wasn't really interested necessarily in making artworks, but rather trying to convey ideas, this is essentially an engineering project. And he made this work in 1972, and it was remade successfully in 1973, originally at Gallery House on Exhibition Road, where the Goethe Institute now stands, was for 1 year an incredibly experimental space. And what you see here is a bellows on top of a chamber of water. So this is the bellows when it was originally situated inside the building, and flooded the basement on that occasion. And this is when it was situated outside, being constructed. And you have a 9-meter tall structure with a 1 foot diameter cylinder containing seawater. And John Latham proposed this for a model for capturing wave energy from the sea. So he was imagining there being kind of offshore farms of these. So essentially a way to capture wave energy, which has only recently become a viable form of power generation. He was interested in the fact that this bellows made this sound, so it almost operated as a musical instrument. And for him, this is, well, really we can see this as a kind of a way of understanding for him this breakdown between art and science, and his lack of interest in aesthetics for their own sake, but as a way of communicating ideas. I'm going to move on to another project. This is a work by John Latham called The Five Sisters. This is a found land artwork. So this is the deposits from the shale extraction industry in the lowlands of Scotland. And in the mid-70s, John Latham was on a placement with the Scottish government, or at the time, the Scottish office. So what the artist placement did was work with artists directly, talk to industrial companies such as British Steel and ICI, place the artist with them. They would get a salary directly from the company. They would have access to materials, modes of making, and the idea was that they would be able to show new ways of working with materials that the company hadn't developed. So with ICI, Geoffrey Shaw developed these ways of making inflatable sculptures. John Latham had a placement with the Scottish office and had recently been working with the Coal Board and the Aerial Photography Department of British government. So this occurred at a time when the artist placement group pivoted from working within industry to working directly with the British government. So they were thinking about how these ideas can directly affect governance and the way that people live in society. Tony Benn, the Labour politician, was a huge supporter of the APG. And when John Latham was working with the Scottish office, they wanted to work out what to do with these eyesores, these huge waste heaps. John Latham suggested that using his ideas, he suggested these as time bases of accumulation and etc. and etc. But essentially what he said was that these were best dealt with by leaving them there. And so they became registered heritage monuments. This is another one called The Nidri Woman. This is another work by John Latham. This is, you can see the scale here, the houses scale, huge mountains. And this is a document of the Five Sisters work that's in the Tate collection. So another idea of this is, because they work with many artists in placement, the artist Ian Breakwell was placed within the Department for Health, and he was working at Broadmoor Prison. The evaluation of his project that he wrote is still under the Official Secrets Act, because what he did was highlight the terrible conditions in which people were being held in, which at the time was seen as standard within the prison and the complex. And by an outsider being positioned within that, raised the fact that this was not the correct way to do things. I think I'm going over time, so I may go a little bit faster. But in 1976, John Latham was invited to be part of Documenta. 1977, John Latham was invited to be part of Documenta 6. And through Joseph Beuys, began working with the West German government and discussing ideas of how to implement incidental person approach within their bureaucratic structures. This was a presentation of that project in 1978 called The Government of the First and 13th Chair. And this was actually the same work performed in 2012 at Wising Arts Centre when I was the curator there. So we recommissioned this work to make this again and reperformed it in the exhibition space. This was very useful for me because it helped me understand so much of John Latham's ideas, and it's an incredibly important work because it's his way of, via performance, of communicating this very complex idea of placing artists within government. So I'm just going to come to an end soon, because I wanted to talk about briefly Flat Time House now and how Flat Time House operates. So Flat Time House has been an institution since 2008, and here we have an image of the artist Laure Provost working with John Latham. She was John Latham's assistant at the end of his life, and she became one of the first artists in residence who actually lived in John Latham's house, in his bedroom, lived in the house itself, and then made an exhibition within the house. So the way the house operates is that its artists live in the space. The whole house is used as an exhibition space and as a research space and as a studio. Laure went on to win the Turner Prize and is representing France at Venice next year. Other artists who have lived in the house are Rory Pilgrim. We also worked with Mark Kmishamovitz, who was a contemporary of John Latham, who also did work at Gallery House in 1971. And you can see here, transformed the house, carpeting it, and including his glass collection, painting all of the walls. And so the house is non-static, it constantly changes. It's not like a typical heritage space. Also recently worked with the German artist Lina Hermsdorf, who worked with a performer in the space. This was in collaboration with Kunstlerhaus Bremen, and she installed a large sheet of reinforced glass which bisected the house and included this work from John Latham's residency placement in Clare Hall Hospital. These are x-rays of his body. This is the same work at Flatheim House. It included a computer-controlled sound installation that went from space to space to space, with this being the outcome of a year-long research project working with the John Latham Archive. More recently, we worked with Ben Kane, whose work dealt with event and time base, and most recently, the last exhibition was with Stina Marie Jacobsen, who worked with young people in Peckham and Camberwell, teaching them law and getting them to rewrite UK law with professional lawyers relating to UK stop and search law. And these are then being proposed to UK politicians for suggested amendments to the law. So, sorry. Yeah. I'll just come to an end. We also do a journal of John Latham's art and ideas called Noit. The next one's coming out in July, and it's written with Noah Latham, which is John Latham's son, a philosopher based in Calgary. So when I go home after this, I'll be doing more copy editing. And I had a film that I wanted to show by Lord Provo, which he made in the house, but I don't know if...
I give it a go.
I don't know if the sound's connected. I hope so. That's it. Obviously, it should be shown with sound. But thank you very much.